Hello and welcome to this tutorial. Today we'll be building this simple physics scene and introducing some of the core concepts for using physics with clones in Notch. I'm going to start by going to my basic scene and I'll add in my tack object. If I add it into the viewport, it'll automatically connect to the root. I can put it to the side. Next, I'll add some basic lighting just so I can see what's going on. I'll add a HDR skylight, which will come in with some of my nodes already pre-connected up. I'll just rotate a little bit and lower the brightness a bit. It's a bit bright right now. Okay, next I'm going to change my object. It's a bit smooth, but I want it to be sharper. So I'm going to set the normal facing mode to flat. So we've got hard edges across the object. And now's a good time to start looking at physics. First, I'll add in a physics root. So the physics root, like any other root node, manages the core behaviors of a physics system. Any node you want to use with physics, either dynamically or as a collider, should be connected to the physics root in some way. So this object I want to use as a collider, so I'm going to drag the physics root, hold control, and insert it between the root and the object. Now, this object is going to exist as a collidable object, but it needs something to collide with. So I'm going to add some clones. I'll start with a random cloner. I'll connect that to the root and a rigid body effector. I'll come back to this one later. And I'll use the hint from the random cloner to get my 3D primitive. So that's giving me all of my clones in this scene. And now I'll connect my rigid body effector to my random cloner. Now this is only going to be using its own internal physics. In order to actually pay attention to the physics of the collision of this collision object, we need to connect the physics root to the rigid body effector. If I reset my scene, and I'll just disable floor collisions on this object, you can see that as it falls, some of the balls are colliding with my object here. Now they're all falling with gravity and I don't want them to do that. So I'm going to turn off gravity on my physics root and I'm going to add a rigid body force effector. So this node is just going to allow me to apply a force to all the rigid bodies in this scene. I'm going to set it to attract so they all get pulled into the center. And it's a bit slow, so I'm going to raise it quite a bit. There we go. Now, you'll probably be noticing that these objects, they aren't colliding with this surface yet. They seem to be colliding with something invisible. And that's because this object is using a convex hull, which is sort of a facsimile of this object, which is hidden, but can be useful to improve performance. If we go to the 3D objects physics properties, we can see here the rigid body shape, as I mentioned, is a convex hull. If we tell it to use the original geometry and reset my scene, now our objects are colliding with the surface. It is a little bit slow though, and that's because the rigid body here is also using convex hulls. Now, convex hulls are more performant than raw geometry a lot of the time. But we can actually go a lot faster, especially with these spheres, by telling it to use a sphere object for collisions instead. Now, sphere collisions are expecting a radius from the 3D primitive. So I'll set the size mode to radius 2 and just reset the scene. And we can see now all our objects fly in and collide with my object. Now it's all a bit uniform, so I'm going to go to my random cloner and randomize the size a little bit more. And I think I'd like another object to be in here too. I just want there to be a few more smaller objects than there are larger objects. So I'll take these objects, pull down the randomization slightly and the scale a bit too. I also need to add a duplicate rigid body effector. The same rigid body effector can't connect to multiple cloners, or at least it won't sim the way you might expect. So I've got to create a separate rigid body effector here. And you can see because I'm copy pasting it, it's still using spheres, and they'll all be scaled to match anyway. Now, one thing we need to think about when we use two random cloners is that they're both going to use the same seed. So if you can see here, all of these clones are in exactly the same places as these clones. So I just need to go to my random cloner and just change the seed. If I reset my scene, we can see they're all being placed randomly. You don't have to worry too much about two clones if they intersect. I can't quite see any here, but if they were, oh, there we go. Because the rigid body system will, on start, it will try and separate anything that's overlapping. And it will do it in a way that tries not to accumulate any forces. So we'll just see it pop around each other and then pull together. Right, that's looking really nice. I think the next thing I want to do is start animating my object. So I'm going to add in a math modifier. I'll set its math function to interpolated noise because I quite like the smoothness of this noise. I'm going to connect it to the rotation heading. This is going to be a fairly small amount, so I'm going to now raise this by a pretty decent scale, so 90. And then I'm going to set the speed to 0.5, just so it doesn't move quite as quickly. And you can see now, as it rotates, it's pulling the objects in different directions. Now, one thing that is kind of annoying is as this rotates, we can see it's basically oscillating from one side to the other. I really want this to evolve and sort of grow and rotate over time. And I found a great way to do that is by adding an accumulator. I'm going to add this to my node graph, connect the math modifier. And we don't need to change anything else. We can just leave it. And we can see now it's happy. It's freely rotating in any direction. So I'll just make a couple more copies of this and I'll apply them to the rotation pitch and rotation bank too. I'll also offset each of these copies just so the animation we see isn't uniform on each axis. And there we go. We've got a lot more animation going on in this scene. It is a little bit unstable, and that's because each of these collisions is imparting a force into the rigid bodies. So I'm just going to go into my force effector, add a small amount of dampening to it. So what this allows us to do is reduce some of the forces being applied by certain effectors. So now we can see the force effector is dampening some of the motion of those particles as they get pulled inwards. But it's also helpful to sort of make some changes to the global force properties. I like to have a little bit of a dampening force just to again reduce the amount of energy that's being input into the simulation and just smooth things out. But I will have quite a bit of smoothing because this can really help with any instability that grows in the scene, especially with rigid bodies that are moving into rigid colliders. While we're looking at the physics root, it'd be a good time to look at the update frame rate. The update frame rate is defined in updates per second. So this value will be split between frames over time over the course of a second. Higher values here will improve the accuracy and stability of a physics simulation, but it can come at the cost of some performance. Bounding this value is the update min and max, which limit the number of frame updates per frame to maintain stable performance on live projects. For this scene, I'm intending to render to video, so I'm not too worried about the performance impact, but I do want to improve the stability of my clones. So I'm going to increase the update frame rate a bit, along with the min and max value. Another thing that can impact performance is the bounciness of each object. So if we go back to my rigid body effector, in fact, I'll select both, because we can alter it for both. We can see the bounciness is set to 0.5, which means of the amount of force that goes in, it's going to reflect back with 50% of that energy. Now, bounciness is great for a lot of physical interactions, but for this scene, I actually don't want very much bounciness. I want these objects to fall and mostly stay together on this surface. So I'm going to take the bounciness down to 0.05. Friction and bounciness are a two-way street though. Bounciness on the colliding surface is also relevant here. And for the same reasons, I'm going to take the bounciness here as well to 0.5. And now my clones are pretty stable on this surface. And that's the core of this effect. So now it's time to start playing around with the lighting and start making this look good. I'll start by getting rid of my skylight and adding a few area lights. I tend to use my area lights with a null because it makes my life a lot easier when placing them around in the scene. I'm just going to set the brightness quite high. Another thing I like to do is I'll set the normalize intensity to area enabled. This just means that as I move the skylight around and scale it upwards, oops, we can see the actual intensity of the area light isn't changing. Now that I'm adding lighting, it's probably a good time to add a renderer too. So I'll just add the hybrid renderer. Now, given that I'm working with area lights, I think it's a good time to enable area light shadows. So I'll set them to be ray traced. You can see how that's affected my surfaces here. Also worth adding a camera so I know what perspective I'm going to be looking at all these objects from. I want to pull it fairly far back. And I'm going to increase the zoom factor quite a lot as well. I want this scene to run with depth of field. So I'll turn on depth of field here. And I can use Control middle mouse button to set where I want the depth of field to generate from. So it's going to be around here on this surface. Bring it a little bit further forward than the rest of the object. On the camera, I can then increase the focal blurriness, and this will increase the amount of depth of field we'll see on this surface. That's not quite high. Yeah, we can start seeing it on the edges there. And now would also be a good time to start adding some objects in the background, some backdrop planes. So I'm going to add a plane. I'll just bring this down here. Another thing to keep in mind with physics is it tends to work better with larger scenes because it's got more room for precision. So that's why this scene is fairly large. I'm just going to scale this object up. And I'll add a second copy of that object too. You see this little bit of artifacting here. This is probably a good thing to touch on. So this is coming from the hybrid renderer in its probe-based mode. If we view the probes here, you can see there's thousands of tiny little dots here, each being used to generate the bounce lighting. And this is just way more than this scene will ever need. A lot of times you can look at this value as being probably lower than you actually need it to. In this case, I can set it to 1. As we hit play, we can see the lighting looks pretty much the same as it was before. So just worth keeping in mind, you can probably keep this value higher than you think you need it to. If I look at through this scene through the camera again, I think this floor is a little bit high, so I'm going to bring it down. I think I'm a little bit far away, so I'll zoom in a little bit closer. Again, when you zoom in, you will change the focal plane too, so I'll just bring that back as well. One light is never enough, so I'll add in a couple more. I'll keep using my null as my target point. Remember to always look through your camera so that you know what your lighting is actually going to look like. And if I don't want to see my surface, I can just disable visible surface. And lastly, I'll add one more fill light. Again, using that target node. Now for the fiddly bit of trying to get this lighting balanced. There we go. This is all still looking a bit white though, so it's probably time to start looking at the shading and materials. So for these clones, I think I want them to be a little more plasticky, so I'm going to add in a material. I'll bring in a little bit of metallicness, but not too much, and then up the roughness, just so we can see a little bit of sheen on the surface. Now these other clones, which are a bit smaller, I want them to feel a lot more metallic. So I'll do the same again, but I'll buff the metallicness quite a lot. This center object, I think I want it to be quite shiny as well, but a little bit less rough. So I'll come down here, make some room for a material. I'll add that too. Once again, increasing the metallicness by quite a lot. You can see how these objects are all colliding with each other and interacting with the lighting too. Now, this is all still very grey, so now I think it's a good time to start adding some colour. I'll go to my random cloner. I'm going to add in a color ramp effector. I'll make sure to add this in before. I'll make sure to add this in before my other effectors, because this means that it will be generated before the clones are simulated. And I'll use a hint to get a color ramp, and I'll start giving it some colors. By default, it's going to just start with black and white, and it'll be doing them over based on their position in X. By default, the color ramp will just come in black and white, and it will be applying them over the X position. I'm just going to change my source channel to be totally random, so each value is each clone is getting a different value. And I will give myself one more color to work with, and we'll just give them some really big primary colors. That's a little more colorful. I think I can also add a little more color to my background plane as well. So I'll add in another material. Let's see what color I want here, what's going to work. I think it worked better with the blue, actually. And this is where you can then start getting really artistic and starting to try and find different ways of adjusting the lighting, getting that extra hit on the light over here. Maybe make this light really big, so it's a larger surface. Of course, once you make it bigger, you have to make it an interesting shape too. There we go. A little bit of like a arc to it. One more thing I just noticed. Look at these metallic objects. They're all still fairly silvery. And this is because the color ramp deformer is applying to the color channels of these objects. Now we want to use the color that we're applying from this on the specular channel. And we can do that by just telling the color map to apply to the specular color too. Now we've got a lot more color in here. Another thing is these objects are all a little bit too smooth for my liking, so I'm going to add in a fractal noise and use that to break up some of these shapes. I'm looking for something that's going to be quite dimpled and broken up, so I think one of these will do that quite nicely. Increase my resolution a bit. In fact, I know it's going on a sphere, so the aspect ratio is usually around 2:1 for mapping to a sphere. I'm just going to increase the scale a lot, so there's lots of tiny little pock marks. Now I'll add in a generate normal map. And I'll apply this to the normal map input. It'll look quite a bit strong at first, but that's not a problem. We can just increase the depth scale. We can soften it up a lot. We can also just decrease the normal intensity on the material too. I think this looks reasonably good. And that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.